This is Professor Stephen Litch in the Principles of Economics, and I'm going to be analyzing the impact of immigration on several aspects of the economy, but especially on the labor market for native workers. And I like talking through this as an example that we can, or of how we can use our tools from economics. Our model of demand and supply, a market equilibrium, our analysis of what happens when a demand curve or a supply curve shifts, and the concept of surplus. We can use all of these tools to make predictions about how something like immigration will impact different sectors of the economy. Okay, I'm going to start off with the labor market in the economy. This is a standard model for a market. On the vertical axis, we have price. In this case, the price of labor is the wage paid to workers, and quantity on the horizontal axis. In this case, quantity is the amount of labor employed. There's some demand for workers, and then SN is the supply of native workers. Okay, so here's the economy prior to immigration. Then, economy is going to have an equilibrium. Equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. So that's this point right here. The equilibrium wage is W star. So that's the price of labor, the wage paid to workers in equilibrium. And the number of workers employed in equilibrium is EN star. Okay, so equilibrium employment. And the little n here is emphasizing this is the employment of native workers in equilibrium. Okay, so standard market, here's the equilibrium. Next, let me show you all areas of surplus. So remember, the surplus to suppliers is the area above the supply curve up to the price, and as far out as the amount sold. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about workers selling their labor. The price they receive is the wage. So all of this green area is surplus to workers, native workers. That's all there are in the economy right now. The area above the wage up to the demand curve, that's the surplus to the buyers in the market. So in this case, the buyers of labor, those are employers. Okay, so again, here's the market prior to immigration. Then some immigrants arrive. And when immigrants arrive in this economy, it's going to shift the supply of workers to the right. So this red curve, this is SN plus SI, the supply of natives and immigrant workers. Okay, so again, when the immigrants arrive, they shift out the labor supply curve, and the market will have a new equilibrium. And this new equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. The equilibrium wage is W prime, and equilibrium employment E prime. So relative to the equilibrium before immigration, wages are lower, but total employment has increased. Now, of course, part of the reason employment has increased is there are simply more workers. There are more, these immigrants have added to the labor supply. So if we want to know what has happened to employment of native workers, the supply curve for the native workers tells us that the number of natives willing to work at W prime, this new wage, number of natives willing to work at W prime is EN prime. Okay, so this is thinking a little bit more than we have about what our supply curves mean. A little more than we have in the past. But even though the supply curve for natives plus immigrants, that tells us the equilibrium, it's still useful to know the supply curve for natives, because that tells us how many natives are employed at this wage of W prime. Okay, so remember, the initial equilibrium occurred where Sn intersected demand, so that's right here. Now that there are immigrants, total employment has increased to E prime, but some of those are the new immigrant workers. The number of natives working at this new equilibrium wage is En prime. So employment of native workers has gone down. And similarly, surplus to native workers has gone down. Remember, surplus is the area, supplier surplus is the area below the price down to the supply curve. So below the price down to the supply curve, as far out as the quantity sold. So En prime is the quantity of native labor sold. Okay, so this area is the surplus to native workers after immigration. And I can compare that to the surplus area before immigration. So let me switch to that slide. Okay, green, surplus to native workers before immigration, and then after. So that area shrinks. Again, before immigration and then after immigration. The fact that this surplus to native workers has become smaller means that this change hurts native workers. Fewer of them are employed, and the ones who have jobs receive lower wages. Okay, now I want to bring up a couple other things. One is that there are some other groups in the economy, including employers, and employers will benefit from more cheap labor. And so even though I don't have this marked in a diagram, employers' surplus is everything above W prime to the demand curve as far out as E prime. So that has in fact increased from prior to immigration to after immigration. Employers profit from more labor and cheaper labor, but also consumers will benefit from labor. So remember, these workers are producing something. Let's call it widgets. And so let's look at here, market for widgets. This big picture on the left, here's market for widgets. The little picture here on the right, that's what's happening in the labor market. So prior to the arrival of immigrants, there's a market for widgets, some supply of widgets, and some demand for widgets. The market for widgets is in equilibrium at a price of P star, and the quantity of widgets sold is Q star. Okay, and then the labor market, we talked about this equilibrium prior to immigration. We talked about that before. Okay, now the immigrants arrive. Oh, sorry, they haven't arrived yet. Here, pictures with surplus area. So this little graph on the right, we saw that before. This is employer surplus, worker surplus prior to immigration. But the important thing now, or the new contribution in this slide, is it shows consumer surplus before immigration. Okay, and I'll show in just a minute. With immigration, consumer surplus increases. Okay, remember, consumer surplus is a measure of the benefit that the purchasers of widgets, the consumers of widgets, get. Okay, so this is all prior to immigration. Then the immigrants arrive. Okay, little picture on the right. That's again what happens in the labor market. Immigrants arrive. They shift the labor supply curve to the right. The market has new equilibrium with the lower wage. Okay, now that impacts the market for widgets. Remember, one of the factors that will shift a supply curve in a market is the cost of production. And if one of the factors of production becomes cheaper, again, if one of the factors of production becomes cheaper, the supply curve will shift to the right. It's an increase in the supply. So in this case, I've marked that the lower cost of labor will increase the supply of widgets. All right, so the widget market will find a new equilibrium, and price will be P prime, quantity sold will be Q prime. So the equilibrium has moved from this little point on the initial supply curve down and to the right, P prime and Q prime. So the price of widgets has gone down and more widgets are being sold. Both of those changes are good for consumers. So consumer surplus after immigration is this gold area, brown or yellow colored area. As always, surplus for the demand side of the market is everything below the demand curve down to the price being paid as far out as the quantity purchased. So here's the market for widgets with cheap labor compared to the market for widgets with more expensive labor. Okay, this is before immigration, the consumer surplus. Here's consumer surplus after immigration. Cheaper labor is good for consumers. It increases consumer surplus. All right, now, so let me summarize the model so far. We looked at what would happen to the labor market when immigrants arrive in the country. And the important finding as far as native workers are concerned is that the arrival of immigrants will hurt the native workers, reduces their wages, reduces the number of native workers who have jobs, and that area of worker surplus becomes smaller. That's our real measure of the well-being of native workers. Okay, so native workers are hurt by the immigrants. There are a couple of groups who benefit. Employers benefit, and consumers of what these workers produce, those consumers benefit. Okay, but I'm going to raise some questions about that analysis. The most questionable assumption was when we use this model of a market, we make a couple of assumptions. And one of them is that all the goods being sold in the market are identical. Okay, and I would say maybe that's not true for labor, especially the types of jobs that immigrants do might not be identical to the types of jobs that native workers do. That's almost certainly true. Almost every occupation in the economy is disproportionately immigrant or native workers. And actually, it's even more complex than that, because the immigrants will come, in any particular occupation, the immigrants will come disproportionately from some parts of the world, but not other parts. So the main thing is immigrants are not doing jobs that are identical to the native workers. And maybe we should build a better model with that feature. So that's going to be my next set of slides. Okay, here I've separated my graphs into two different markets. One is a market for native labor. The other is a market for immigrant labor. Okay, and I'm going to present this as if initially there are some immigrants in the country, then more immigrants arrive. Okay, but going to these markets, again, one market is for the types of jobs that native workers do. There's some demand for workers in these jobs, and there's a supply of native workers to the jobs. The two axes in this graph, the wages paid to natives and employment of natives. Similarly, there's a market for immigrant labor. This is, again, before the arrival of immigrants. There's some demand for the immigrant labor, some supply of immigrants to this job. Both of these markets are in equilibrium. There's a wage paid to native workers, an equilibrium wage of WN star, number of native workers employed initially, EN star. Over in the labor market for immigrants, the equilibrium wage is WI star, and number of immigrants employed, EI star. Okay, so I've got things set up initially, and I'll observe that the surplus to the native workers before immigration is this orange area. As always, surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve for the people selling. In this case, the workers are the ones selling, and as far out to the amount sold. Okay, so surplus prior to the arrival of new immigrants. Okay, now let me focus on the market for immigrant labor. So market for immigrant labor before new immigrants, there's an equilibrium wage of WI star, employment of EI star. Then new immigrants arrive in the country. The arrival of new immigrants shifts the labor supply curve for immigrant workers, shifts that supply curve to the right, and the market finds a new equilibrium. This new equilibrium wage is WI prime and employment EI prime. Okay, so this is a basic analysis of shifting a curve around. What happens when the number of sellers in a market increases? The answer is it shifts the supply curve to the right, and then the new equilibrium price is lower, and the equilibrium quantity sold increases. Okay, now, what about the market for native workers? I think this is this is an interesting application of the idea of prices of related goods. Okay, so remember when we talked about demand, we said that one factor that would shift a demand curve around would be prices of related goods. And there are two types of related goods: substitutes and complements. And I probably give as an example of substitutes like pizza or hamburgers, where a person wants to eat one but not both. Complements are like peanut butter and jelly. A person wants both, or kind of wants both more than just having one or the other. Okay, so that's going to be how, so I'm going to think of native labor and immigrant labor as being related goods from the perspective of employers. So employers are using these two different types of labor, and a change in the price of one type of labor will impact employers' demand for the other type. Right here in this slide, I have my initial setup for the two markets. We've seen this before. Here's equilibrium before the arrival of two immigrants. Before the arrival of new immigrants. Then immigrants arrive in the labor market for immigrants. And I've got this going on kind of in the background to remind you that the arrival of immigrants shifted the supply curve to the right, and the price of immigrant labor, the wage paid to immigrants, falls. Okay, now, if these two types of labor are substitutes, a decrease in the price of the substitute will reduce demand for this good. So, if immigrants and natives are substitutes, employers want one type of worker or the other in the same way, employers want one type or the other, but don't really need both in the same way that your appetite might be satisfied by eating a pizza or a hamburger, but you don't need both. Remember, that's what substitutes are like. If the two types of workers are substitutes, then when immigrant labor becomes cheaper, employers hire more immigrant workers, and that reduces their demand for native workers. Okay, and as a consequence, the equilibrium in the market changes. When demand for native workers falls, there will be a new equilibrium wage paid to native workers, WN prime, and employment of native workers, EN prime. The wages paid to natives falls, and fewer natives have jobs. Okay, so then surplus to native workers, as always, it'll be the area below the wage down to the labor supply curve as far out as the number of natives employed. So here's the surplus to native workers if they are a substitute for immigrant workers. Okay, so let's look at the surplus to native workers after the arrival of immigrants compared to before the arrival of immigrants. And, here, before, large area of surplus. After the arrival of immigrants, a smaller area of surplus. If the two types of labor are substitutes, okay, well, and you should simply think of this as if the two types of workers fulfill the same needs for employers, then the immigrants are taking away jobs from the native workers, and because immigrant labor is cheaper, actually, I should say it that way. It's not so much that they are taking away jobs directly, rather, the arrival of immigrants reduces the price of immigrant workers, and then because immigrant labor is cheap, employers stop hiring native workers and instead hire immigrants. Okay, so that's the process of how employment and wages of natives fall due to the arrival of immigrants. Okay, but again, that is the analysis if the two types of labor are substitutes. What if they are complements? And some types of jobs work together well. So I imagine like a doctor and a nurse are two jobs that work together well. They're more productive working together than each of them would be on their own. That's complementary, or those types of labor are complements for each other, complements to each other. Or think of a supervisor and the workers that the workers under that supervisor. They are doing complementary jobs. They need one another to function as a group. Okay, so let me do this analysis, and you can imagine, for example, a construction site where the manual laborers are immigrants, but the managers of these work crews are native workers. And then think through what's going to happen when more immigrants arrive. and immigrant labor becomes cheaper, employers hire more immigrants, but then they need more natives to manage the work crews. So it actually increases their demand for native workers. Or imagine, in the medical example, that there's a wave of immigrant nurses who arrive in the U.S. Now, of course, they will crowd out the jobs of native nurses, or very likely will compete with native nurses for jobs, would be a substitute for the native nurses. But those immigrant nurses might be a complement to the work that native doctors do. Okay? So as more immigrant nurses arrive, employers, hospitals, for example, hire more nurses, and then the nurses make doctors more productive. And because the doctors are more productive, there's more demand for them. Okay, so let me talk through this model if the two types of labor are complements. Again, I've got my two markets set up initially before the arrival of new immigrants. The labor market for native workers is in equilibrium, and the labor market for immigrants is in equilibrium. Okay. Then, the arrival of new immigrants shifts the supply curve for immigrants to the right, and there's a new equilibrium, wage paid to immigrants and employment of immigrants. So we've seen this little graph before. The interesting thing is what's happening in the market for native workers. Because immigrants have become cheaper, employers are hiring more immigrants, and that increases demand for native workers. Remember, with complements, a reduction in the price of a complement increases demand for this good. Okay, so in this analysis of immigration, the two types of labor are complements to each other, and the reduction in the price of immigrant labor results in an increase in demand for native workers, a shift to the right in the demand curve for native workers. Then the labor market for natives will have a new equilibrium where supply and demand intersect. New equilibrium wage will be Wn prime, new equilibrium employment En prime. Okay, so final thing that final thing is I want to note these changes. So from before the arrival of the immigrants to after the arrival of immigrants, both wages and employment have increased for native workers. So here again, before, here after, wages and employment have both increased. So these immigrants, or the arrival of new immigrants, is good for the native workers. And surplus is actually the more official way of measuring the benefit to the native workers. Surplus is everything below the wage down to the labor supply curve as far out as the number of workers employed. So here's the surplus after the arrival of the new immigrants, in contrast to before. Okay? Before, there was a smaller area of surplus to native workers. After the arrival of the new immigrants, that surplus area increases. Okay, so again, cheaper immigrant labor increases demand for the native workers, resulting in higher wages and higher employment of natives. And both of those cause the increase in surplus. Okay, so I've talked through several models relating to immigration. The important results, I guess, are first, immigration increases profits to employers. That's always true. Second, immigration increases consumer surplus. Again, that's always true. In the first model, we showed that if immigrants are doing exactly the same jobs as the natives, then they will reduce native surplus. And more generally, in the second model, we saw that if the two types of labor are substitutes, then the arrival of immigrants will reduce surplus to native workers. But in the third model, we talked about the case where the immigrants do jobs that are complementary to the jobs natives do. And in that case, the arrival of immigrants increases the surplus to native workers. Okay, so that's going to conclude this little lecture.